What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actresses faces off against late-night television's most unpredictable host? You won't believe what unfolds when Natalie Portman sits down with Stephen Colbert for what was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance, only to witness one of the most explosive confrontations in talk show history. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses clash in ways nobody saw coming. Last night's episode of The Late Show started like any other. The studio audience buzzed with anticipation as Stephen Colbert delivered his opening monologue, his trademark wit sharp as ever. But what nobody in that theater could have predicted was that within 30 minutes, they'd be witnessing television history in the making, and not the good kind. Natalie Portman entered the studio with her usual grace, dressed in an elegant black blazer, her demeanor professional yet warm as she greeted the crew. The Oscar-winning actress had come to promote her latest directorial project, a deeply personal film exploring themes of female empowerment and social justice. What should have been a straightforward interview about her artistic vision would instead become a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral out of control. The warning signs were there from the very beginning, though most viewers probably missed them. As Portman settled into the guest chair, Colbert's usual charm seemed slightly off-kilter. His smile appeared forced, his energy more manic than usual. Those familiar with his work might have recognized the subtle shift. This wasn't the Stephen Colbert who typically welcomed A-list guests with genuine enthusiasm and respect. "Natalie Portman, everybody," Colbert announced to thunderous applause, but there was something in his tone that suggested this wouldn't be the celebratory interview his audience expected. Harvard graduate, Oscar winner, director, producer. "Is there anything you can't do?" Portman laughed politely, clearly not sensing the undercurrent of sarcasm that would soon become impossible to ignore. "Well, I can't seem to parallel park to save my life," she replied, with a self-deprecating smile, drawing genuine laughter from the audience. But Colbert wasn't interested in the easy banter that typically opens these segments. Instead of following up with the natural flow of conversation, he immediately pivoted to something more confrontational. "Let's talk about your new film. Another story about women overcoming adversity. Don't you think Hollywood's gotten a little predictable with these narratives?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Portman's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her media-trained smile remaining in place, but her eyes showing the first flash of confusion. This wasn't the discussion she'd prepared for, and it certainly wasn't the respectful dialogue she'd been promised by the show's producers. "I think stories about resilience and empowerment are always relevant," she responded carefully, clearly, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "My film explores themes that are unfortunately still very current in our society." Colbert leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Right, but don't you think there's something a little self-congratulatory about Hollywood constantly patting itself on the back for being so progressive? I mean, you're making millions of dollars making movies about fighting the system while being very much part of that system." The audience began to sense the shift in energy. The usual comfortable rhythm of a late-night interview was being replaced by something more combative, more unpredictable. Portman's posture straightened slightly, her professional composure intact, but clearly tested. "I think art has always been a vehicle for social commentary," she replied, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious provocation. "Artists have a responsibility to use their platform to highlight important issues, regardless of their personal circumstances." "Responsibility," Colbert repeated, drawing out the word as if it tasted bitter. "That's interesting. Speaking of responsibility, let's talk about your personal life for a moment. You've been very vocal about certain political issues, very critical of various politicians and policies. But some people might say that's pretty rich coming from someone who lives in a bubble of privilege." The studio audience grew noticeably quieter. This wasn't the playful ribbing that Colbert was known for. This felt personal, aggressive, and completely out of left field. Portman's smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure, but the damage was already visible. The easy rapport that should have characterized this interview was nowhere to be found. "I believe everyone has the right to express their political views," Portman said, her tone becoming more guarded. "And I think it's important for people in the public eye to speak out about issues they care about." Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by her discomfort, feeding off the tension he was creating. "But isn't there something inherently hypocritical about lecturing ordinary Americans about their choices while you live in a completely different reality? I mean, when's the last time you waited in line at the DMV or worried about paying rent?" The question was clearly designed to provoke, and it was working. Portman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since sitting down, she looked genuinely annoyed rather than simply caught off guard. The professional mask she wore so skillfully was beginning to crack, and everyone in the studio could sense it. "I think that's a rather simplistic way to view civic engagement," she replied, her voice carrying just the slightest edge. "The fact that someone is successful doesn't invalidate their right to participate in democratic discourse." "Democratic discourse," Colbert echoed mockingly. "Is that what we're calling celebrity activism now? Because it seems to me like a lot of wealthy entertainers telling regular people how to think and vote while living lives that have nothing in common with the average American experience." The tension in the studio was now palpable. What had started as an uncomfortable line of questioning was rapidly escalating into something that resembled an interrogation more than an interview. Portman's publicist, visible in the wings, looked increasingly concerned, clearly debating whether to intervene. But this was only the beginning. As the commercial break approached, neither Portman nor Colbert showed any signs of backing down from what was quickly becoming one of the most uncomfortable interviews in recent memory. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing brilliant television or a complete disaster in progress. What they didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. As the cameras rolled again after the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio had shifted dramatically. Gone was any pretense of civility or professional courtesy. Colbert returned to his desk with the predatory energy of someone who had tasted blood and wanted more, while Portman sat rigidly in her chair, her earlier warmth replaced by barely contained frustration. "We're back with Natalie Portman," Colbert announced, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm. "Before the break, we were discussing the responsibilities of celebrities in political discourse. But I'm curious about something else, Natalie. You've built your career on playing strong, independent women, but isn't there something ironic about an industry that claims to champion female empowerment while systematically exploiting women? Behind the scenes?" The question was a trap, and everyone in the studio knew it. Portman's eyes flashed with recognition of what Colbert was attempting to do: force her into a no-win situation where any answer would be twisted against her. But she'd underestimated just how far her host was willing to push things. "I think the industry has made significant progress," she began carefully, "though there's obviously still work to be done. That's exactly why projects like mine are important. They're part of the solution." Colbert leaned forward aggressively, his entire demeanor transforming into something almost predatory. "But let's be specific here. You've worked with directors who've been accused of various improprieties. You've taken roles in films produced by companies with questionable track records. How do you reconcile your activism with your career choices?" The studio fell dead silent. This wasn't just confrontational anymore. It was a character assassination happening in real time on national television. Portman's face went through a series of micro-expressions: shock, anger, and then something harder to read: a steel-like determination that suggested she was done being pushed around. "I think that's an incredibly unfair characterization," she said, her voice low but carrying clear warning signs. "I've always been vocal about supporting survivors and creating safer working environments. To suggest otherwise is not just wrong, it's deliberately misleading. But Colbert wasn't finished. If anything, her pushback seemed to energize him further. Deliberately misleading? That's interesting phrasing from someone who's made a career out of public relations and image management. Tell me, how much of Natalie Portman the activist is genuine conviction, and how much is just good branding? The audience collectively gasped. This had crossed every line of professional courtesy and entered territory that felt genuinely hostile. Portman's hands gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles visibly whitening as she struggled to maintain composure in the face of what could only be described as a public ambush. "I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, Stephen," she said, using his first name with deliberate emphasis, dropping all pretense of the usual host-guest dynamic. "But if you're suggesting that my advocacy work is somehow disingenuous, then you clearly haven't done your homework." Colbert's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Oh, I've done my homework. I know about the private jets to climate change conferences. I know about the lectures on income inequality from someone who earns more in a month than most people see in a lifetime. I know about the feminist messaging from someone who's worked within a system that's historically oppressed women. So please, enlighten me. How do you sleep at night with all that cognitive dissonance?" The attack was so vicious, so personal, that even the studio crew looked uncomfortable. Cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most toxic interviews in television history. Portman's publicist was now openly gesturing from the wings, clearly signaling that they needed to end this immediately. But Portman wasn't backing down. The Academy Award winner had found her fighting spirit, and when she spoke again, her voice carried an authority that cut through Colbert's bluster like a blade. "You want to talk about cognitive dissonance?" she said, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Let's talk about a talk show host who built his career on political satire and social commentary, suddenly attacking someone for political commentary and social engagement. Let's talk about someone who's made millions entertaining people while simultaneously mocking them for caring about the world around them." The reversal was swift and devastating. For the first time since the interview began, Colbert looked genuinely rattled. He'd expected to steamroll his guest with his aggressive tactics, but instead found himself facing someone who was more than capable of fighting back with equal intensity. "That's not the same thing," he stammered, his composure slipping. "For the first time. I'm not standing on moral high ground telling people how to live their lives." Portman's laugh was cold and cutting. "Aren't you? Isn't that exactly what you're doing right now? Using your platform to tear down someone who's trying to make a positive difference? What exactly is your endgame here, Stephen? What point are you trying to make besides demonstrating that you can be cruel to a guest on your own show?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and suddenly the power dynamic in the room had completely shifted. Colbert, who had seemed so in control just moments before, now appeared petty and vindictive in the face of Portman's dignified fury. The audience, initially shocked into silence, was beginning to murmur with obvious discomfort. "My point," Colbert said, his voice rising defensively, "is that people are tired of being lectured by Hollywood elites who have no understanding of real-world problems. You want to save the world? Start by acknowledging your own privilege, instead of pretending you're some kind of voice for the voiceless." "And what about your privilege?" Portman shot back, her composure finally cracking as anger took over. "What? About your platform, your influence, your ability to reach millions of people every night? How are you using that responsibility? By tearing down people who are trying to make a difference? By reducing complex social issues to cheap talking points for applause?" The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Both participants were now openly hostile, their voices raised, their professional masks completely abandoned. This was no longer television entertainment. It was a public battle of wills happening in front of millions of viewers. Colbert's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. "At least I'm honest about what I am. I'm not pretending to be a saint while living like a..." Like a what? Portman interrupted, standing up abruptly from her chair. Finish that sentence, Stephen. Tell everyone exactly what you think of me. The studio fell completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to freeze as everyone waited to see if Colbert would complete the thought that was clearly on the tip of his tongue. The moment stretched endlessly, charged with tension and the promise of something irreversible about to happen. What came next would determine whether this interview could somehow be salvaged or if it would end in complete disaster. Colbert's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The unfinished insult hung between them, poisonous and damning even in its incompleteness. His face cycled through shades of red as he realized he'd been caught in his own trap, exposed as nothing more than a bully who had finally met his match. "Go ahead," Portman pressed, her voice deadly quiet now, more threatening in its controlled fury than any scream could have been. "Tell America what you really think. Show them the real Stephen Colbert, the one who invites guests onto his show just to humiliate them for cheap laughs." The silence stretched unbearably. Colbert's mouth worked soundlessly as he struggled to find some way to recover from a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his control. His usual quick wit had abandoned him entirely, leaving him exposed and flailing in front of his own audience. That's not what he stammered. But the damage was already done. Every second of hesitation only made him look worse, more petty, more cruel. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing their beloved late-night host transformed into something unrecognizable and ugly. Portman stood tall, her dignity intact despite the vicious assault she'd endured. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of someone who had been pushed too far and was finally pushing back. "You want to know what privilege looks like, Stephen? It's using your platform to attack people who are trying to make a difference. It's thinking you can invite someone onto your show and tear them apart for entertainment. It's believing that cruelty somehow makes you clever or relevant." Her voice grew stronger with each word, transforming from defensive to accusatory to something approaching righteous fury. The cameras captured every moment as one of Hollywood's most respected figures delivered what could only be described as a masterclass in standing up to a bully. "You sit behind this desk every night and mock people for caring about things," she continued, her voice cutting through the studio's oppressive silence like a sword. "You reduce complex issues to punchlines and act like cynicism is wisdom. But what have you actually contributed? What positive change have you created beyond making people feel superior for not trying?" Colbert finally found his voice, but it came out as a weak croak. "This is my show, and Your show?" Portman interrupted, her eyes blazing. "Your show where you ambush guests? Your show where you attack people for having the audacity to care about something? Your show where you've apparently forgotten the difference between comedy and cruelty?" The words hit like physical blows. Colbert visibly recoiled as if he'd been slapped, his face cycling through expressions of shock, anger, and what might have been shame. The man who made his living with words seemed to have lost them entirely. "I don't think you understand," he began weakly. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Portman cut him off, her voice sharp enough to cut diamond. "I understand that you brought me here under false pretenses. I understand that you thought you could score easy points by attacking someone who's actually trying to make a difference. And I understand that you've shown everyone exactly who you really are." She began gathering her things with deliberate, controlled movements, each action a statement of defiance. The studio remained dead silent except for the soft sounds of her preparing to leave. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they should continue filming this unprecedented moment. "You know what the real tragedy is here?" Portman said, slinging her purse over her shoulder with practiced grace. "You had the opportunity to have a real conversation about important issues. You could have used your platform to discuss meaningful topics, to engage with ideas that matter. Instead, you chose to be small and petty and mean." Colbert finally seemed to find some semblance of his composure, though his voice still carried a tremor of uncertainty. "Now wait just a minute." "No, Stephen, I'm done waiting. I'm done being polite while you attack my character for the entertainment of your audience. I'm done pretending that this is acceptable behavior from someone in your position." She turned to face him directly, and for a moment the camera caught them in perfect profile, the dignified actress standing tall, and the talk show host shrinking in his chair. The visual metaphor was impossible to miss. "You want to talk about responsibility?" Portman said, her final words carrying the weight of judgment. "Your responsibility is to your audience, to the people who trust you to inform and entertain them. Tonight, you failed them spectacularly. You've shown them that you value cruelty over conversation, attack over understanding." She paused at the edge of the interview area, turning back one final time. "I came here to talk about my work, about stories that matter, about issues that affect real people's lives. Instead, I've been subjected to a personal attack disguised as an interview. That says everything about you and nothing about me." The silence that followed was deafening. Colbert sat frozen behind his desk, his mouth slightly open, looking like a man who had just watched his career implode in real time. The audience remained completely still, too shocked to applaud, too confused to react, too stunned by what they'd witnessed to process it fully. "Thank you for showing me, and everyone watching, exactly who you are," Portman said with devastating politeness. "It's been illuminating." With that, she walked off the set with her head held high, her heels clicking against the studio floor in a rhythm that sounded almost like a countdown. The cameras followed her until she disappeared beyond the stage lights, leaving behind a studio full of people who had just witnessed something unprecedented in television history. Colbert remained seated behind his desk, his face a mask of confusion and barely contained panic. The man who had started the evening as a confident host had been transformed into something smaller, diminished by his own cruelty. His usual quick recovery skills seemed to have abandoned him entirely as he stared at the spot where his guest had been sitting just moments before. The audience began to stir uncomfortably, unsure whether they should applaud, leave, or simply pretend this had never happened. Some pulled out their phones, already recording or typing, instinctively understanding that they had witnessed something that would be discussed and analyzed for years to come. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, Colbert attempted to regain control of his show. "Well, we'll be right back after these messages," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. But everyone in that studio knew the truth. There was no coming back from what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, one of late-night television's biggest stars had revealed himself to be nothing more than a bully who had finally met someone who wouldn't back down. As the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the only sound was the echo of Portman's heels still ringing in everyone's ears. The sound of dignity walking away from a man who had forgotten what it meant to have any.